Now, as the children in your household grow and as they develop, their identity and your goal for them never changes. Remember, we've already talked about that your goal for them is to aim them toward faithfulness to Jesus Christ, and their identity is as potential or actual brothers and sisters in Christ. That never changes. Your goal never changes. But your role as their parent does change during each stage of a child's development. Early on in their life, it's more an emphasis on you as their authority, that it goes to you more as an interpreter, and last of all, to you as a guide. Now, I don't mean to suggest, even slightly, that you cease to be an authority when they cease to be a child, or that you cease to be an interpreter when they become a young adult. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is that these are the primary roles at each stage of your child's development. When they're younger, you're primarily their authority. When they get to be in early adolescence, you're primarily an interpreter, and later adolescence and into young adulthood, you're primarily a guide. But these things aren't exclusive, where one goes away completely. They kind of fade together, we might say. But here's what I want to do in this session. I want us to think about how, in each stage of our child's development, how our role changes and how we can point them most effectively toward faithfulness to God and towards Jesus Christ at each stage of their development. So let's look first at your child as a child, when they're younger. And as I said, your primary role at that point is as their authority. You are the authority at that point. Here's what that means practically. You don't negotiate with them. Whenever I hear a parent beginning to negotiate with their child, they've already lost the negotiation, even if they win the negotiation. What I mean by that is by them being willing to negotiate with their child about things, about, no, I don't want to do this. Yes, well, what do you want to do? And trying to appease and negotiate, they've already lost at that point. You don't negotiate with terrorists, and they're little terrorists, okay? So you don't negotiate with them. Rather, you make it clear from the very beginning that you are their authority. There's simple ways that you do that. Some of the ways that you do that is we don't give open-ended choices to our children, especially as they're younger. We say, would you like to do this or this? Would you like to this or this or this? It's a limited number of choices that we give to them, and they must know that we are the authority. They don't negotiate with us to try to get their way or to get something different. In our household, here's one of the things that we have done is that if a child really feels like that they need to make some sort of a comment back when we tell them to do something or ask them to do something or give them choices, we give them the capacity to say, may I make an appeal? And so we may say something, and if there's something they know that we don't that's really important that may stand in the way of instant obedience at that point, our children can say, may I make an appeal? And we will hear that appeal. Now, they know not to overuse that or to misuse that, but it's something important to do with our children that we've found that's helpful for them, that establishes that we are the authority and that you are not, but that gives them an opportunity to speak into things if they happen to have maybe information that we don't have. Now, you might think, why is this even important that we are the authority in a child's life? Well, let's think of what a child is like and how God has created them to be. Children are amazing, wonderful creatures, and God has created them in their childhood to be collectors and classifiers. Now, what I mean by that is the easiest way for us to think through that is for you to think, what did I collect and classify when I was a child? Now, for most of us, we can think of something that we collected and classified as a child. For some people, it may be baseball cards. For some people, it may be shells or rocks or bugs. There's all sorts of different things, but most of us collected and classified something. Why is that? Why do children do that? Well, it's because they are ordering and making sense of their world. They're looking at their world and they're organizing it and making sense of it. This is a beautiful and good thing. This is how God created them to be. You see, really what they're doing at that point is they are fulfilling in their own little way God's mandate to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to take care of that garden, to organize it, to till it, to take this garden. And it seems that God's plan was for this garden eventually to extend around the globe in this, taking the wasteland, we might say, and turning it into a garden. Well, that's what they're doing in their own little way when they collect and they classify. It's a beautiful and a good thing. But part of that collecting and classifying is they need to recognize hierarchy and authority. They need to recognize that there's somebody in charge and it is not them. They need to recognize that's part of the categorizing and classifying in life, is that there's a goodness in hierarchy. You'll notice children, they have this very clear sense of fairness. That's not fair. I want to do this. Somebody else gets to do something that's not fair. But there's something else to notice. They always want the fairness to be slightly in their favor, which is actually unfair. They want it slightly in their favor. Well, what we see in that is that due to the fall, due to the fact that they're sinners, there's a desire within them as well to subvert the authority, to subvert the rules that are placed upon them, to subvert that, to rise up and to become the one in charge, we might say. And part of what we must do as parents is to train them to recognize appropriate and God-honoring authorities. For them to understand in this stage of life that if God were truly fair, we would all be condemned. For them to understand the goodness of God's authority, God's sovereignty over us, for them to see the goodness in all of these things. And so it's important for us to be the authority over our children and for them to understand and see the goodness in that. Now, our purpose in that is not to make them perfect little minions, though there are days that it's helpful if they're perfect little minions, but most of the time they aren't, and that's not our goal and that's not our purpose. But rather, our goal and purpose is for them to understand there is a boss and it is not you. And for them to understand the goodness and to trust that. Now, when they get to early adolescence, when they hit puberty and that stage right there, we want to begin transitioning them out of this stage. Now, do we cease to be an authority? No, we don't cease to be an authority over them. But what we want to have done is to develop a competency within them, a capacity within them so that they recognize and they respect appropriate authority. And we want to be able to transition them out. And I think it's important for us to mark as parents transitions between different stages of life. And this is one that we can mark by, many people mark it by some sort of a celebration of and a commitment to purity in their sexuality, for them to save their sexuality for marriage, for us to talk through with them what it means to be a sexual being in God's image, and for them to see the beauty and the goodness of that and to commit themselves to purity in that area of their lives. But it's important for this to follow this emphasis on authority. And the reason it is because we want them to understand that the reason we're calling them to this is because God is authoritative over their sexuality. For them to submit to the sovereignty and authority of God over their sexuality. I don't know about you, but in the youth groups in which I was raised in and the churches I was raised in as a child, the message about sexuality was, it's evil, it's nasty, it's bad, so save it for the one you love. But then as I got into being a youth minister, the message at that point became true love waits. It's best for you, it's good for you if you wait until marriage. Your life will be better if you wait to express yourself sexually until you're married. It'll be better for you. And that's certainly true. But it really doesn't get at God's vision for our sexuality. So what we're wanting to establish in this transition from childhood into adolescence is a submission to and a recognition of the goodness of God's vision for their sexuality, that God is authoritative over sexuality and His way is right and good. And I want to do this for the glory of God in a way that glorifies Him instead of merely pleasing or serving myself. Now, in our particular family, one other thing we do at that point is that we expect them to serve in the church at that point. So about a year or so before that time that we are going to transition them into some different areas and responsibilities, we ask our children to start looking for what area you want to serve in the church, because I want my children to be serving in the church all the way from the time they are in late childhood, early adolescence forward. I want them to do that. So our older child, she decided when that time came that she wanted to work in childcare. So the church made a place for her to work in some very minimal ways at first in childcare. And as she's grown in that, she's become more in charge of different areas of childcare. Now, our middle child, we don't want her in childcare because she likes to talk to people and chatter, and she would not pay attention to any of the children. But because of that, because God has created her that way with this very extroverted personality, she's a great greeter at church. And so she's a greeter at church. She greets people, hands hands out the bulletins as they come in. But I think it's important that we recognize that so that children don't have the idea that their years, in their teenage years, in their adolescent years, somehow they are just supposed to receive from the church but never give back. We want to develop habits of service from the very earliest stages of them walking with Christ. And so that's sort of that first era when you're the authority in your child's life. Now, what happens in adolescence is they begin to need more and more an interpreter. Now, let's think about the character of how God has created adolescents to be. When puberty hits, some things that I'm going to oversimplify at this point, but I'm just talking in general terms here. What happens in puberty is the limbic system in their brain, it sort of leaps forward into full maturity. And that's the part that governs generally their emotions. And yet the frontal part of their brain, which governs things like making plans for multiple things at once, being able to juggle multiple tasks, being able to think rationally and reasonably, that actually develops much, much more slowly and doesn't actually reach full maturity till their mid-20s, that part that governs reason and rational and logical reflection and thought. So what you have in an early adolescent is somebody with emotions that have leaped all the way forward to adulthood, but with a rationality that is still on its way, is still developing. Now, that's not to excuse in any way, shape, or form behavior. That's not to say, oh, they just do that way because of their brain. It's not to say that at all. We need to teach them to be responsible agents, responsible moral agents, even as teenagers, and not to excuse this. But remember, God designed them this way. This isn't an accident that they are this way. And because they are this way, their emotions leap forward before their rationality catches up completely. Teenagers are people who dream big and they feel deep. They dream big and they feel deep. So they might go on a mission trip, and when they come back from that mission trip, they are going to adopt every single orphan in the entire continent of Africa within the next 2 years. I mean, they just have these big visions and these big dreams that are completely irrational and completely emotionally driven. But they dream big and they feel very, very deeply. Now, here's what that means practically. As they tend to make their decisions on the basis of their emotions, they have a hard time distinguishing between what has short-term relevance versus what has long-term relevance. So if they have a bad hair day and they trip and fall in the lunchroom and splatter food everywhere, they authentically feel like and believe, in early teenage years in particular, that their life's over. Their social life has over because they had one really bad day. Why? Because they have a hard time distinguishing between the short term and the long term. They also tend to assume that others' perceptions of them are the same as their perceptions of themselves. And so even if somebody isn't intending to at all, they'll read somebody else's assumptions or read somebody else's actions in a way that reinforces what they feel about themselves. So if they feel they are a certain way, they're going to read what others do around them as reinforcing what they feel about themselves, even if it isn't the truth at all about themselves. So if they feel like they're not smart, they're going to read the comments to them and the things people do and say as reinforcing that feeling that I'm not smart, even if the people didn't mean it that way at all. Now, the temptation sometimes when you have a teenager is to try to squelch and kill those emotions, because just like, okay, get them under control, push them down and get them under control. But we don't want Stoics. We want Christians. We want people who live and who love deeply and recognize that this is indeed something that is part of God's good design and plan. So here's what we need to help them to do and to be as their interpreters. Remember, this stage of life, we're their interpreters. For them to see their emotions as signposts that reveal their heart, to help them to see that, to help them to understand it. I feel this way. What does this reveal about my heart? One of the things that I found helpful as a parent at times in trying to help interpret their emotions and to see them as a signpost that reveals their heart is when they do something foolish, after everything's kind of calmed down afterwards, for me to take it, sometimes I've used a whiteboard to do this, and ask them the question, when this happened, when you chose this, what did your heart really want? And with very few exceptions, most of the time, what they wanted in their heart was actually not a bad thing. I wanted this person to like me. I wanted to make these people laugh. I wanted this to happen or that. That was not a bad thing. So then I draw a circle on the whiteboard and write in that what their heart wanted. And then kind of draw some lines out from that and said, okay, let's think of all the other ways that you could have sought that same goal that you had at that point? What are some other ways that you could have accomplished that same goal without making the choice that you made? Well, what am I doing at that point? I'm helping them to see their actions and their emotions as signposts to reveal what they desire, what they want in their heart, and for them to think through other ways of fulfilling these desires, if they're good desires, in ways that are wise instead of foolish. Now, what I'm wanting to develop and to foster in that, in being their interpreter, is I want my children to trust me even when they don't understand. I want them to trust even when they don't understand. When I say no to something, I want them, because I'm their interpreter, helping them understand their world and their emotions, I want them to trust me even when they don't understand why I said no to something or why I said you need to do this. Now, here's the tough thing that actually requires when we're being an interpreter for our teenager, is that we have to be willing as parents to say, I'm sorry sometimes, to say, I blew it. I thought this was the right call and it wasn't. And there's nothing, I don't believe, that will build better trust with our teenager than when we, in the moments that we really are wrong, for us to say, I made the wrong call on that and I'm sorry. We have to be able to do that, and we're able to do that because of the gospel. Because of the gospel. See, I don't have to prove myself right to my child because I've already been declared right in Jesus Christ. And so I can say I'm sorry to my child because of the fact that the gospel has already made me secure in Christ. So how do we transition them out of this adolescent stage in which we are their interpreters? Well, there's a lot of different ways we might celebrate the end of that and move them into the next phase. We might send them on a mission trip or go with them on a mission trip in which we say, when we leave, we're treating you as a teenager, but when we return, it becomes, we're going to enter into that time of preparation for you to be an adult. There may be all sorts of different ways to celebrate it, either at their high school graduation or maybe a little bit earlier than that even. But whatever we do, we need to set clear expectations for what it's going to mean to be an adult. Because this is the phase of life that many students today get stuck in, where they don't ever quite move out of adolescence and into adulthood. They live in what is often called adultolescence, where they aren't really able to make that preparation and success in moving all the way into adulthood. We need to help them and set clear goals for that. But we move then into the phase of emerging adulthood, of their preparation for mature adulthood, and we become not their interpreter, but their guide. We become a guide in their lives. Now, during this time period, the emerging adults, they tend to become very analytical, questioning their past assumptions. And the downside of that is that they can grow to be cynical, very hypercritical, hesitant to commit, and they don't really follow through very well when they make commitments. And those are some of the areas of challenge in their life during this time. And as a guide, what we need to be able to do for them is to set clear goals for what it looks like for them to become an adult, to be an adult. And not just an adult in the world's sense of the term, but an adult who seeks to glorify and to honor Jesus Christ with their lives. There's 3 competencies that when I sat down with my daughter to think through this, that I set forth before her, that I said, these are the things I want you to strive toward in terms of what it means to be an adult. And the 3 that I set before her were commitment. You have the capacity to commit. And that doesn't necessarily mean, though for some it will mean marriage. That's what for some of them it means, is that commitment is to be married. But not just that, but a commitment to a particular community of people, whether you're married or not. To say, I'm going to have this community of people, this church, and I'm committed to this body, and I am going to seek the good of these people around me and be committed to them and committed to live in community with these people in this particular church, in this particular neighborhood, in this particular job. I'm going to commit. And kind of tied with that is carry through, the capacity to say, not only will I commit, but when I make commitments, I will carry through and do what I said I will do. And the third one of those, commitment, carry through, and then care for yourself. Now, of course, that means little things such as doing your own laundry, cooking your own food, and things like that. But it also includes some bigger things like taking care of your own finances and paying your own insurance, those things like that. And those are the ones that at least I set forth, commitment, carry through, and caring for yourself, as what I consider to be the markers of adulthood, of moving toward adulthood in life. Now, how do we celebrate the end of this stage when they've met these competencies, when we've said, you've done it, you've got commitment and carry through, and you've been able to care for yourself? How do we celebrate, and what do we do at that point? Well, here's what I have looked toward and looked forward to and seen other people do, is to have some sort of a blessing of a recognition you have moved into adulthood. This might be a blessing of their first apartment or their first house that they buy, or it can be involved in and tied with when they get married, if we recognize that they've moved to this point of adulthood. But whatever it may be, we need to celebrate and mark that point at which we say, you have done it. You're an adult. You're acting like an adult. You can commit. You can carry through. You can care for yourself. And we're celebrating this, and we're proud of you, and we're glad for this. We give our blessing to you, and we are so proud of you. So we need to recognize and celebrate this particular time. We need to bless them, and we need to say, we're proud of you. That isn't to say that we withhold our blessing and withhold our pride until they make it to adulthood, but it is to say that we celebrate in such a way that they recognize we are particularly proud of them, and that we give our blessing to the life into which they're embarking. A few months ago, I had an experience with our oldest daughter that in the midst of all of this kind of reminds me of the importance of some of these different roles in our children's lives. I've said over and over to our children, I've also said it publicly, these phrases right here. I said, I would rather my children be on the other side of the world seeking God's will than living right next to me not seeking God's will. And I'd rather them be in a grave in God's will than in a mansion in rebellion against God's will. I've said that over and over, and honestly, I say that as much as anything else because I want to remind myself of that my priority for my children is not for them to be successful, it's not for them to live right next to me and us to have some sort of a happy American life together in that way, but rather for them to invest their lives in the kingdom of God. And a few months ago, my oldest daughter, she got a hold of me and said, I'm in the wrong degree program. She was in a counseling degree program. She said, I'm in the wrong degree program. And I said, okay, how do you know that? And she said, I chose this degree because of the fact that I wanted to stay closer to home. She said, the truth is, I need to be in a missions degree. That's where I'm supposed to be. And we talked about it. There were some tears and just kind of thinking through what this means for our lives. And as we talked through this. But what I found interesting is at the end of that conversation, she said, you always said you'd rather me be on the other side of the world in God's will than right next to you outside God's will. And she said, I always wondered if you really believed it. And I said, the only thing I could say honestly, so did I. I wondered it too, because I didn't really know. And there's so many areas of our lives that we don't really know until a much later time the impact we have on our children. And in that particular instance, I didn't know that my child had ever really listened when I had said those words. But I found that when she came to me at that point, those words were ringing in her head and wondering, does Dad really believe that? Does he really believe and does he really feel that he'd rather me be in God's will and on the other side of the world than living here and outside of God's will? And we don't know what impact we're having sometimes until much later. And so as you look at your child's life as an authority, an interpreter, and a guide, there are going to be 1,000 times that you're thinking, this child is not listening to anything I'm saying. I'm having no effect. If I'm having any effect, it's a negative effect, that I'm just terrible as a parent. And I felt that way too. But in this, when we live consistently and in faithfulness to Jesus Christ, and when we fall short, we apologize, we confess our sin. God works through that, not because of our great efforts and great successes, but in spite of our failures and in spite of our efforts sometimes. But God does great things through small faithfulness as you lead, as you guide, as you disciple your child.